John Halsey never thought that his life could change overnight. An ordinary evening turned into a nightmare that changed everything. He returned from work late, as always, tired and annoyed after a long day at the office. He usually walked along a busy road lined with houses with soft yellow window lights. Something has changed today. The street seemed deserted. A cold wind crept under his jacket, and the lights were dimmed. He didn't want to think about it, but the feeling of something sinister haunted him at every step. The phone went dead, and John felt isolated. At that moment, he saw that there was a car in front of him. Not his car, he was sure of it. She was standing on the same curb where his old SUV usually parked, but this time a dark sedan took over, with the windows closed and the headlights off. John stopped, looking at the car. There was nothing to be seen inside, no movement, no light. He felt strangely uneasy. Looking around, he noticed that the other cars parked on the streets were just as lifeless. No one left the houses, no one was driving on the road. It's like the whole world is frozen. Deciding not to approach the sedan, John walked on, accelerating his pace. His house was 3 blocks away, but every step was difficult. When he finally saw his building, relief washed over him. The house seemed the same as always, with the lights dimmed from the inside. John reached for the keys, but stopped. The sound of footsteps came from behind him. A nervous tick jerked his hand, causing him to drop the keys. Looking over his shoulder, he saw no one. Silence enveloped the street. He quickly picked up the keys and ran into the house, closing the door behind him. After locking the door, John heard his home phone vibrate. It seemed strange to him. No one used landlines these days. When he picked up the phone, he heard heavy breathing. "You're still here," said a rough, hoarse voice. "We're behind you." The pipe fell to the floor with a crash. John froze in place, feeling his body go cold. His breathing quickened, and he realized that something had changed in the house. He usually knew every sound, every creak of his house, but this time it felt like he was in a strange place. Gradually, the tension increased. He slowly began to look around the rooms. There was silence in every room, but it felt like he was being watched. The barely audible footsteps on the second floor confused him. Time passed, but his mind refused to accept the fact that someone or something could be upstairs. After climbing the stairs, John paused at the door to his bedroom. A faint light penetrated through the crack, but it did not give a sense of security. The hand on the door handle was shaking. He slowly pushed the door open, and it opened with a soft creak. But the room was empty. Feeling stupid for being paranoid, John sat down on the bed. But something remained wrong. He heard the whispers again. At first it was quiet, barely perceptible, and then it became louder. It was the same voice he had heard on the phone. "You're still here." John was sitting on the edge of the bed, his heart beating like a hammer. The voice he had just heard faded into the silence as if it had never existed. The room looked completely normal. Everything was in its place. A chair near the window, a closet, the bathroom door slightly ajar. But his mind was in chaos. Who could have called? How could this voice appear and disappear so quickly? And what did those words mean? "You're still here?" Deciding that this was probably just a figment of his imagination after a long day at work, John got up and went to the window. There was still the same empty street outside the window. His gaze fell on the very car that was parked outside his house when he first returned. But now something has changed. The headlights of the car were on. Bright light was shining directly into his window, flooding the room with an ominous light. It was wrong. The headlights had been turned off before. Someone in that car was watching him. John felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He wanted to close the curtains, but he couldn't bring himself to take his eyes off the car. Something moved inside the car. The man who had been sitting motionless before began to slowly turn his head towards the house. John couldn't make out the face, just the outline of the head. The movement was slow, as if the man inside the car was deliberately stalling for time. Suddenly, the headlights of the car blinked, and everything was plunged into darkness. The car disappeared, as if it had never existed. John took a sharp step back, losing his balance and almost falling. At the same moment, a strange sound came from the hallway. It was something between a creak and a rustle, as if someone was dragging a metal object across the floor. John turned abruptly and walked to the bedroom door. He tried to convince himself that all these were random sounds, that his imagination was just playing out. But the closer he got to the corridor, the more distinct the sound became. The metal was still creaking, now right outside the door. John froze at the threshold, not daring to open the door. His hand was already reaching for the handle when suddenly the lights in the house flickered and went out. The darkness fell on him like an ink stain. Only the moonlight from the window allowed him to see anything. He was breathing heavily, listening to the silence. "It's just a power outage," he whispered to himself, trying to calm down. "Just an old wiring." But as soon as he said that, the sound outside the door came again, louder and closer. I could hear something heavy moving on the floor, and then the sound suddenly stopped. Unable to withstand the tension, John abruptly opened the door. The hallway was empty, but there was something metallic on the floor in front of him. He looked down and saw a hammer. It was his hammer, which was usually kept in the garage. How did he end up here in his bedroom? Who brought it? John quickly closed the door and stepped back. A strange feeling of helplessness gripped him. He was locked in his own house, but something or someone was here, next to him, playing with his mind. Deciding that he needed to check the whole house, John grabbed the phone again and turned on the flashlight. The feeling of paranoia grew stronger with every step. He went downstairs, inspecting every room along the way. There was nothing unusual in the kitchen and living room. But as he approached the basement door, he felt that the air had become thick, as if something was hiding below. John stopped at the basement door. It was bolted, but there was a faint, flickering light coming from under the door. Maybe it's just a light bulb flashing, he thought. But who turned on the light in the basement? John was pretty sure he hadn't turned it on. He slowly opened the door and shone his flashlight down the stairs. The basement was the same as always. Old boxes, racks of tools, a bunch of unnecessary things. But something has changed. There was a TV set in the corner, next to the shelves. It was an old TV that he had thrown away a long time ago. John was sure he was gone. And yet he stood there, flickering with static noise. John took a few steps down, but suddenly the TV went out and the basement was plunged into darkness again. Only the sound of his footsteps echoed through the room. He froze, feeling that something was watching him, and it wasn't imagination. At that moment, the door on the second floor slammed shut. The sound was so loud that John almost dropped the flashlight. It became so quiet in the basement that the air seemed to freeze. John abruptly turned around and ran back upstairs. One thought was beating in my head. Someone is here. I have to get out. When he reached the hallway, he noticed that the front door was ajar. It was impossible. He had definitely closed it when he entered. He approached the door cautiously, his hands trembling. Opening it wider, he looked out. The street was empty, but the feeling that he was being watched did not disappear. Suddenly, something moved in the shadows. Without hesitation, John ran outside and ran away from the house. Every second seemed like an eternity. John was running so fast that his breath was coming in short gasps and his heart was pounding in his chest like crazy. He did not look back, but he felt that something was following him. His feet carried him through the empty streets, and the cool night air hit him in the face. The city was sleeping, oblivious to his desperate escape. The lights of the nearest store flashed in the distance, and John aimed there. He needed to be among people, somewhere safe. When he reached the door of the convenience store, he ran inside, panting. Fluorescent lights flickered, illuminating shelves crammed with groceries, as if nothing was happening here. A couple of people moved slowly between the rows, ignoring his worried look. John grabbed the nearest shelf, trying to catch his breath and get his thoughts in order. He didn't understand what was going on, and most importantly, what he should do next. At the exit, a security guard, a woman in her 40s, stood at the cash register, leafing through a magazine in a bored manner. John decided to turn to her, hoping for at least some help. He came closer and stammered and began to speak. "I'm sorry. Can I talk to you for a minute? I think someone is watching me. It can be dangerous." The woman, slightly surprised by his appearance and strange statement, raised her eyebrows, but immediately replied, "Yes, of course. Let's call the police if it's serious." John nodded, feeling the fear slowly let go. But as soon as he relaxed, a strange sound came from behind him, like a soft scrape of metal on metal. He turned around abruptly, but there was nothing suspicious in the store. Ordinary customers. But the sound was too familiar. The guard, noticing his reaction, cautiously came closer. "What happened? Everything is fine?" John took a step back, his eyes widened, and he muttered softly, "This is it. I heard that sound at home." The woman did not have time to answer, when suddenly the lamps in the store flickered. The flickering light was confusing. Suddenly, the entire store was plunged into darkness, leaving John and the others in complete silence. "What the hell is this?" the guard muttered, taking a flashlight out of her pocket. John heard that sound again, a metallic rustle, very close now. His hands trembled, and he didn't know what to do. He grabbed the woman's hand, his voice was full of despair. "You don't understand. It's here. We have to get out of here." The woman wanted to say something, but suddenly there was a loud bang at the door of the store. First once, then again. The impact was so strong that the glass shook. The guard's lantern illuminated the doors, but nothing could be seen behind them. Emptiness. However, the sound did not stop. "This can't be happening," John muttered, feeling his legs go wobbly. "Someone is breaking in." The woman pushed him away and headed for the door. "I'm going to see what's going on there." But as soon as she got closer, the sound disappeared. The store was plunged into an oppressive silence. John could only hear his own heavy breathing and the thudding of his heart, but the silence was only for a moment. There was a loud crack as the store's doors shattered into splinters. The guard, without having time to react, was thrown back, and John only saw for a moment how her body fell lifelessly to the floor. There was no one in the doorway, only darkness, endless and thick, filled the space. He knew he had to run, but his legs refused to move. Numb with horror, John could only stare at the broken door. "There is one thought in my head. What kind of power is this? Why did this happen to him?" "You're still here," the voice whispered. The same voice he had heard in the bedroom, but now he was very close, as if he was whispering right in my ear. John whirled around, his eyes darting through the darkness, but there was no one there. Only silence, only emptiness. He started moving again. His body suddenly started moving. Running, hiding, all he knew was that he had to get out. Running out into the street, John didn't even look back. John ran blindly, his feet barely touching the ground. He didn't look back, didn't try to figure out exactly what was going on. His heart was pounding in his chest, his thoughts were rushing to the sides, but one idea was firmly rooted in his mind. He had to run away, anywhere, just not stop. The emptiness stretched around him. The city seemed to be frozen. No cars, no people, no sounds. Only dim lights in the distance hinted at the presence of life. But with each step, this feeling became weaker. Something was driving him forward. Suddenly, out of nowhere, an old gas station appeared in front of him, which John had once seen at the entrance to the city. The building looked abandoned, peeling paint, broken windows, rusty structures, and inside darkness and abandonment. But even this gloomy shelter seemed safer to him than the open street. John rushed inside, slamming the door behind him and trying not to make any noise. He froze, listening, waiting for footsteps, screams, or that metallic rustle that had haunted him all night. But it was quiet. The silence was thick, enveloping, as if everything had stopped. John's gaze darted to the old shelves. Empty bottles, dried dirt, and remnants of a once-existing life were scattered everywhere. The light above the cash register, barely alive, blinked, and for the first time he felt at least a little safe. "I'm safe here, they won't find me here," he repeated to himself, trying to convince his mind of this. But a moment later, reality came flooding back. Someone has been here in this building for a long time. Next to the cash register, on the floor, John saw an old cardboard box. Inside it were things, neatly folded, but clearly long forgotten. An old leather folder with documents stood out among the clothes and other junk. John automatically reached for it, opened it, and found yellowed sheets of paper inside. He didn't know why he started reading, but he couldn't stop. The documents seemed official, some bills, notes, but one letter caught his attention. "We couldn't find anything. They disappeared, completely gone. We don't know who or what is behind this. We have studied the entire building, every corner, but there is no answer. Traces, the tracks are gone. The signature was missing." John felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He slowly lowered the paper and looked around the room. This document was left here for a reason. Whoever wrote it knew something. He began to look around more closely. In the corner of the room, I noticed a door that led to the back of the building. His feet went there of their own accord. He tried to walk quietly, but every step he took on the creaking floor seemed deafening. A door with a small window led into a narrow corridor where there was almost no light. The smell of damp and mildew hit my nose. The walls were peeling off, and it seemed that they were about to collapse. John stopped, trying to decide whether to go on or go back, but something inside was pushing him forward. The corridor led him into a small room. It was an old warehouse, littered with boxes, shelves, and trash. But there was a leather jacket on the floor, right in the middle of the room. She looked like she had just been left here. Not dusty, not time-worn like the rest. There was a paper bag next to her, and something moved inside. John took a step back, his heart paused for a moment. He bent down and carefully unwrapped the package. There were photos inside, but not ordinary photos. They were pictures of streets, houses, his house. On one of them, he was himself on the day he returned from work. Panic surged with renewed force. John began frantically sorting through the rest of the pictures. They were made on different days, at different times, but always with the same purpose: to keep an eye on him. Someone had been watching him for weeks, maybe months. He never noticed it. And then his gaze stopped at the last photo. It was him, at the very gas station where he was now. The photo was taken outside, through the window. John froze. In the background, he saw something that took his breath away. There was someone standing in the shadows behind him. With shaking hands, he slowly turned his gaze to that very window. The room was empty. But after a moment, his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he realized that someone was standing right behind the glass, watching him. At that moment, John felt his whole body go cold. He no longer felt safe. These photos were proof of something terrible, and now he's become a part of it. He took a step towards the door, but he already knew it was useless. The click of the lock pierced the silence, and the door slowly closed behind him.
The world holds many secrets, dark places where the veil between realities thins. In these shadowed corners, ancient terrors stir, whispers of creatures that haunt our nightmares. Creatures born of fear itself, the skinwalker, the wendigo. Their names alone send shivers down our spines, echoes of ancient dread. These are not mere monsters, they are embodiments of our deepest fears. The skinwalker, a shape-shifting horror from Navajo legend, preys on the innocent. A predator cloaked in familiarity, the wendigo, a creature of insatiable hunger born from the icy heart of Algonquin folklore, stalks the frozen wilderness. Driven by a hunger that can never be sated, their stories have been told for generations, whispered around campfires, shared in hushed tones, a warning passed down through time. A reminder that some things are best left undisturbed, but the human heart is drawn to the darkness. We seek out the thrill of fear. Step closer, dear reader, if you dare. Venture into the heart of these chilling tales, but be warned. Once you hear the whispers in the dark, you can never truly escape them. Imagine a moonless night. Desert wind howls. You are alone, vulnerable. Then you see it. A figure in the distance, approaching. Relief washes over you. It appears to be a loved one, but something is wrong. The eyes, they betray a chilling truth. This is no ordinary creature. It wears the skin of your beloved. A grotesque mockery, the skinwalker, a malevolent entity that can assume any form it desires. It delights in deception, luring its victims into a false sense of security. The Navajo people of the American Southwest know the skinwalker's terror intimately. It is a taboo subject, spoken of only in whispers, for to speak its name aloud is to invite its attention, and once it has you in its sights, there is no escape. The skinwalker is not merely a creature of the night. It is a perversion of the sacred, a corruption of the Navajo way, a reminder that even in the most sacred traditions, darkness can fester. It is a warning to those who would dabble in forbidden magic, for the price of power can be monstrous. The frozen north holds its own horrors, vast, unforgiving landscapes where the wind bites like a hungry wolf. Here, amidst the snow and ice, stalks the Wendigo, a creature born of despair and cannibalism. Its heart is a shard of ice, its breath a frozen fog. The Wendigo was once human, driven to madness by starvation, forced to consume the flesh of their fellow man to survive. But in their desperation, they crossed a line. They embraced their monstrous hunger, and in doing so, they became something inhuman, a twisted mockery of their former selves. It is said that the Wendigo can mimic human voices, luring unsuspecting travelers to their doom with promises of warmth and shelter. But those who succumb to the Wendigo's call find only a frozen grave, their flesh consumed, their bones left to bleach in the unforgiving cold. The Wendigo is a constant threat in the Algonquin folklore, a reminder of the dangers of greed and desperation. It is a warning that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, there are lines that should never be crossed, for the price of survival may be your very soul. Are these creatures merely legends, or do they stalk our world? Stories abound of encounters with these terrifying beings, tales whispered around campfires, passed down through generations, each more terrifying than the last. In the American Southwest, Navajo families speak of strange occurrences, unexplained noises in the night, livestock found mutilated, and always the lingering feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the firelight. In the frozen north, hunters and trappers return from the wilderness with tales of a towering figure, its eyes burning with an unholy light, its breath a cloud of ice crystals. Some dismiss these stories as hallucinations brought on by the harsh conditions, but others know the truth. The Wendigo is real, and it is hungry. These stories, whether real or imagined, serve as a chilling reminder of the power of belief. For what we fear, we often manifest, and in the darkness, anything is possible. Section 5. The Navajo Skinwalker. A perversion of the sacred, the Skinwalker holds a unique place in Navajo culture. It is not merely a monster, it is a perversion of the sacred. To become a skinwalker, one must embrace the darkest of magic. They must commit the most heinous of acts. The transformation is said to be excruciating. The skinwalker is then granted immense power to instill fear in the hearts of men, but this power comes at a terrible cost. The skinwalker is forever cursed, forever bound to the shadows. Section 6. The Wendigo, a warning from the frozen north. The Wendigo is more than just a terrifying monster. It symbolizes the dangers of greed and the corrupting influence of power. The Algonquin people believe the Wendigo spirit can possess those who succumb to their baser instincts. Driven by greed and craving power, they are most susceptible to the Wendigo's influence. The spirit feeds on their desires, twisting them into a ravenous beast. The Wendigo serves as a powerful cautionary tale, a reminder to maintain our humanity and resist darker impulses. Section 7. Similarities in the shadows, twisted reflections of fear. Despite their different origins, the Skinwalker and the Wendigo share striking similarities. Both are creatures of darkness, born of fear and transgression. Both are said to possess shape-shifting abilities, able to assume any form they desire. They prey on the innocent, luring their victims to their doom with cunning and deception. But perhaps the most unsettling similarity between these two creatures is their connection to the human psyche. Both the Skinwalker and the Wendigo represent the darker aspects of human nature, the potential for greed, envy, and violence that lies dormant within us all. They are a reminder that the line between man and monster is thin, and that even the most civilized among us can succumb to the darkness within. These creatures serve as a chilling reminder that we are all capable of monstrous acts, that the potential for evil resides in us all. Their stories serve as cautionary tales, warnings about the dangers of straying from the path of righteousness, of the importance of maintaining our humanity in the face of adversity. Section 8, The Enduring Dread, Why We Whisper Their Names. Why do these legends endure? Why do we continue to tell these stories? Perhaps it is because they tap into something primal within us, a fear of the unknown, of the darkness that lurks at the edge of our perception. These stories serve as a reminder that the world is a dangerous place, that there are things out there that we do not understand, things that can hurt us. They are a way of coping with our own mortality, of making sense of the chaos of the universe. Or perhaps we tell these stories because we need to believe. We need to believe that there are things out there that are more powerful than us, things that can challenge our understanding of the world, things that can make us feel truly alive. Whatever the reason, these legends continue to fascinate and terrify us. They are a reminder that the world is a stranger and more wonderful place than we can possibly imagine. Section 9. Beyond the darkness, the psychological impact of horror. The enduring power of the Skinwalker and Wendigo legends lies not only in their chilling narratives, but also in their profound psychological impact. These tales tap into our deepest fears, exploiting our vulnerabilities and forcing us to confront the darkness that lurks both within and beyond the boundaries of our understanding. The concept of a loved one transforming into a monstrous doppelganger, as embodied by the Skinwalker, strikes at the heart of our need for trust and security. It breeds paranoia, making us question the authenticity of those closest to us and eroding the foundations of our relationships. The Wendigo, with its insatiable hunger and grotesque appearance, embodies our anxieties surrounding consumption and control. It reflects our primal fear of scarcity, of being consumed by our own desires, and of losing our humanity in the face of overwhelming need. Section 10. A haunting echo, fear's lingering presence. As we turn away from these tales of horror, we carry with us a chilling reminder of their power. The Skinwalker and the Wendigo may be creatures of myth and legend, but the fears they embody are all too real. They linger in the shadows of our minds, a haunting echo of the darkness that resides within us all. The next time you find yourself alone in the wilderness or walking down a dark city street, listen carefully. You might just hear a whisper on the wind, a rustle in the trees, a glimpse of movement in the corner of your eye. And remember, some legends are best left undisturbed, for the things that haunt our nightmares often have a way of finding us in the waking world.
Michael has always been a night commuter. There was something about the deserted roads and the silence of the night highway that made him feel peaceful. When his job often required trips to remote corners of the country, Michael had no problem getting on the road, even if it meant crossing deserted highways at night. He was used to the rare lanterns that cut through the darkness, to the lonely gas stations in the middle of nothing, and to the fleeting glances of the rare cars that whizzed by. But that night, something was wrong with his ride. It all started when his navigator stopped showing the route, pointing to an endless, unknown road. It wasn't the first time Michael's technique had failed him in the desert. However, the oddities did not start with the navigator. When he refueled at the last gas station, he noticed that there was no cashier there. Leaving the money on the counter, Michael decided not to dwell on it. The problems of small towns, he thought. The further away he got from the city, the more he felt strangely uneasy. The highway, usually empty and calm, began to look ominous. Michael noticed that all the cars he had seen before seemed to have evaporated. There was not a single headlight around, not the slightest sign of life. It was then that he noticed her, an old, shabby car parked on the side of the road. The headlights are pointing into the void, and the doors are open. Michael slowed down, wondering what could have happened. But stopping in the desert at night, he drove on, adding speed, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave him. After driving a few miles, he saw something strange again. the headlights from behind, which were rapidly approaching. It was too fast to be an ordinary car and too silent. Michael's gaze darted to the rearview mirror. The headlights were getting closer, but the sound of the engine was indistinguishable. The skin on his arms prickled, and he instinctively stepped on the gas, trying to pull away. But even at high speed, the headlights did not lag behind. After driving a few more miles, Michael felt sweat trickle down his forehead. He couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my heart was pounding like crazy. Suddenly, the headlights behind him started flashing, blinding him through the rear window. A thought flashed through my head. Maybe someone wants me to stop? But something inside told him not to do it. It didn't make sense, but Michael felt that if he stopped, it would end up much worse. He increased his speed, accelerating the car to the limit along the winding highway. The headlights were still chasing him, blinking brightly, making his heart beat even faster. The car behind him behaved like a hunted animal chasing its prey. After a couple of minutes, this strange game on the road was abruptly interrupted. The headlights suddenly disappeared. Michael braked, glancing in the rearview mirror. Darkness. No cars, no lights, nothing. He had every reason to relax, but his inner anxiety was only getting worse. Why did all this happen? What kind of car was it? It was only now that Michael realized that in those few minutes he had found himself on a completely unfamiliar stretch of road. The road ahead became narrow, without road signs and fences, as if abandoned. He tried to turn around, but with each turn it seemed to him that the road was going further into the unknown. The fear began to grow, and Michael suddenly realized that he was surrounded only by trees and emptiness. A few miles later, he noticed an old gas station ahead. The light was dimly burning above the entrance, and although Michael didn't want to stop, he needed to catch his breath. He turned into the gas station, leaving the car at the entrance. The gas station doors were open, but there was no one inside. There was an old, dusty cash register behind the counter, and on the counter was a magazine with a headline about some terrible incidents in the area. Michael picked up the magazine, flipping through the pages, but at that moment there was a sound behind him that made his knees tremble. The doors slammed shut with a loud creak. He turned around, expecting to see someone, but the gas station was empty, as before. His heart started pounding wildly, as if something was moving invisibly around him. A sense of impending threat overwhelmed him. Michael rushed to the exit, but the door was locked. And then he noticed the footprints. Boot prints were clearly visible in the dust on the floor, leading towards the back door. Trying not to panic, he pulled out his phone to call someone for help, but the phone was not catching the network. Michael went to the back door, hoping to get out through it, but it was also locked. The walls around him were shrinking, and the air was heavy. Exhausted by panic and powerlessness, Michael sat down on the floor near the door. Suddenly, he heard the sound of a car. It was the same car whose headlights had been chasing him on the highway. He looked out the window and saw this car slowly approaching the gas station. Michael screamed and pounded on the glass, but the car stopped a few meters from the building. No one came out of it. Michael felt a terrible sense of hopelessness. The silence on the street and incomprehensible events drove him to the limit. He no longer understood what was going on and couldn't get out. Michael was breathing heavily, watching the car through the dusty glass. She was standing motionless. The headlights were off, but in the dark she could see someone sitting inside. He couldn't make out the driver's face, just a silhouette frozen behind the wheel. The clock on his phone showed that it had been more than an hour since he had been in this abandoned place. But nothing had changed on the street. It was as if time itself had stopped. Michael felt trapped. He tried to open the door with such force that he tore his nails, but it remained closed. My head was spinning. My mind was frantically searching for a way out, but nothing came to mind. The walls seemed closer and closer, as if they were pressing down on him from all sides. He suddenly felt that he was losing control, that his thoughts were becoming more and more chaotic. A knock. Someone tapped on the glass outside. The sound was quiet, almost imperceptible, but in the deathly silence it sounded like a thunderclap. Michael looked up sharply. The silhouette that had previously been sitting in the car was now standing right next to the window. right next to it. It was terrifying. The figure was unnaturally still, as if someone had purposely frozen in one position. The face remained in shadow, despite the fact that the gas station light illuminated the front of the building. Michael backed away, not taking his eyes off the figure outside the window. He wanted to scream, but his throat was constricted, as if his own fear prevented him from making a sound. Suddenly, the figure began to move. She slowly raised her hand and tapped on the glass again, this time a little louder. The glass under my hand rattled strangely, as if it was about to burst. Michael frantically looked around, trying to find at least something that could help him get out. There was an old fire extinguisher in the corner. Grabbing it with trembling hands, he began to beat on the door. But the old metal structure only gave a dull sound, not yielding even a millimeter. As he hit harder, Michael felt it getting harder to breathe. One question was beating in my head. Why doesn't anyone stop? The figure outside the window suddenly disappeared. Michael blinked, trying to figure out what had happened. He pressed himself against the door, straining his ears, listening for the slightest sound. The car was still parked outside, but its doors were open. The silence around them was frighteningly dense. He moved slowly to the back of the room, trying not to make any noise. Suddenly, he heard an engine start outside. My heart skipped a beat. Is the car really leaving? He cautiously looked out the window, but the headlights illuminated the gas station. The car was still there, but now its headlights were on again, and their light was relentlessly hitting the glass. Michael's eyes were blinded for a moment, and he stepped back, feeling a strange burning sensation in his eyes. Everything suddenly became blurry. When his vision returned, the figure was standing by the window again, closer this time. Now more details could be seen. It was a man of medium height in shabby clothes. His face was hidden by a dirty hood, but Michael could not be mistaken. Something in his posture, in the way he stood, made his blood run cold. It was unnatural. The seconds seemed like an eternity. The man outside the window slowly raised his hand and ran his long, dirty fingers over the glass. The glass cracked with a rattling sound. Michael ran to the side, trying to hide behind the counter. He grabbed the phone and began to dial an emergency number in a panic. There was no response. There was no connection. Nothing. The phone was useless. The figure outside the window did not move, but the pressure from her presence increased. Michael felt the air around him getting heavier and heavier. He realized that if he didn't find a way out now, something terrible was waiting for him. The end is near. He rushed to the back door again, and with the last of his strength, hit it with a fire extinguisher with such force that his hands trembled. The door still wouldn't budge. Despair grew like an invisible scream inside his head. And suddenly, the door from behind opened with such a noise that Michael did not immediately understand what had happened. A man stood in front of him. Not the one by the window, but the other, tall, in a shabby coat and with a chilling look. He was standing right in the doorway, blocking the exit. Without saying a word, he took a step inside. The smell of damp and rot hit Michael in the nose as the stranger stepped closer. It seemed that his presence had swallowed up the entire space around, as if there was no way out. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said in a low but menacing voice. Michael couldn't answer. His body was paralyzed with fear. The man continued to stare at him, and every step he took was like a sentence. The man in the coat stopped a few steps away from Michael, and suddenly the gas station was quiet again. There were no sounds outside, no cars, no wind. It was as if the whole world outside this room had disappeared. Michael could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but his body refused to obey. He froze like a mouse in front of a cobra. The stranger leaned closer, his breath was cold, and his voice was almost a whisper. No one should have stayed here. Michael wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in his throat. The man raised his hand. His fingers were long and dirty, like a man digging in the ground. Slowly, he put her on Michael's shoulder. The contact with that icy hand caused a strong shudder that ran through his entire body. The man continued to look straight into Michael's eyes. There was something ancient in his gaze, something incomprehensible and inexplicable, but not supernatural, just a raw, cold reality. It seemed that this man was witnessing something so terrible that his soul had long ceased to belong to him. "Don't ever go back to this road," he added quietly. And suddenly, the hand on Michael's shoulder tightened with unbearable force. Pain shot through him to the bone. Michael tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. His mind began to blur, and shadows floated before his eyes. The silhouette of the stranger blurred, turning into a dark spot, as if everything around him was swallowed up by darkness. The pressure on his shoulder was increasing, and with every passing moment, Michael felt like he was losing control of his body. The last thing he had time to feel was the cold floor under his knees when his legs gave way. Silence engulfed the gas station again, and in the morning, when the first car arrived, there was nothing at the abandoned gas station. No Michael, no strange man. Only a broken door and a lone empty car stood in the middle of an abandoned highway where no one was supposed to stop. Johnny was a typical guy who had his own plans for life. He was not distinguished by anything outstanding, but he always loved adventures. In his youth, he often traveled around the country, visiting abandoned places, old towns, and deserted factories. His interest in such places was simple. It was a way to escape from the daily hustle and bustle and see how once vibrant life was slowly withering away. One day, Johnny heard a story about an old, abandoned neighborhood that was once residential. There were many houses there, but something made people leave it in a hurry. Time has not spared those places. The roads are overgrown with weeds, and the walls of the houses have turned into ruins. There were several reasons why people left. Some claimed that the authorities had simply decided to demolish the area, while others believed that something more sinister had happened. Johnny decided that this was the perfect place for his next trip. He packed up his gear, took his camera, and headed west, away from the bustling city. By the time he got to this place, evening had already descended on the abandoned streets. The area resembled a picture from the past, where time stood still and every house looked as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. He set up a tent on the outskirts, next to one of the dilapidated schools where local children once studied. There was absolute silence around, which was sometimes broken only by the rustle of the wind in the empty windows. Johnny set up a camera and decided to inspect the houses. Every house he entered was like a time capsule. Abandoned toys, old newspapers scattered on tables, and things forgotten by residents. But it looked like people had left in the blink of an eye. In one of the living rooms, Johnny found photos of a family, parents with 2 children. These pictures, like everything else, were covered with dust and dirt. Johnny held up one of the photos, wondering what could have caused them to leave the house so suddenly. But even at that moment, an unpleasant feeling crept inside him that someone was watching him. He looked around, but there was no one there. There was silence all around, but this silence weighed on his consciousness. He tried to reassure himself that it was just his imagination playing out because of the loneliness and strange surroundings. But just in case, he decided to return to his tent and continue the inspection the next day. When he returned to his tent, the sky had already darkened. Johnny sat down, picked up his laptop, and started looking through the photos taken during the day. He stopped at one picture. It was the house he entered first. Something about this shot confused him. There was clearly a silhouette in the window, which he remembered as empty. Johnny zoomed in on the image, trying to make out the figure, but the image was too blurry. At that moment, he heard a rustle. Someone or something was moving outside his tent. It was a barely perceptible sound, as if someone was carefully stepping on the ground. Johnny froze. He thought it might just be an animal, but the sound didn't stop. On the contrary, it was getting louder, as if someone was approaching. Finally, Johnny made up his mind. He slowly reached for the zipper on the tent and opened it at once, jumping out with a flashlight in his hands. But there was no one outside. There was emptiness all around, and in the light of the lantern, only thickets and ruined buildings could be seen. Then he saw it. Footprints on the ground, fresh footprints that stretched from his tent to one of the nearest houses. They were boot prints, the same as his own. But he was sure he hadn't gone that way. Someone or something left these traces just recently. Johnny was an experienced traveler and knew that he had to act carefully. He returned to the tent, zipped it shut, and decided to stay up all night, continuing to watch. Time passed slowly, and every noise made him tense up. He realized that something was wrong in this area, and perhaps he was not the only person who was here. The next morning, Johnny decided to inspect the house to which the tracks led. He picked up his camera again and headed towards the building. The house was old. The ramshackle walls were overgrown with ivy, the windows were broken. Once inside, he immediately felt that the air here was much heavier than in other places. There were pieces of furniture on the floor, and it looked as if the house had not just been abandoned, but had experienced something terrible. Looking around the rooms, he came across another oddity, a note that someone had obviously left on one of the tables. It was dirty paper with hastily written words. "They're back. We won't have time to escape. If someone finds it, know that we tried." Johnny froze. Who are they? And what could that mean? Was this a warning or an attempt to explain himself? Johnny took some pictures and continued to inspect the house. On the second floor, he found a room that was different from the others. It was smaller than the others, and there was less dust, as if someone had recently used it. Oni noticed another detail on the floor, fresh boot marks. These were not his footprints. Someone had been here before him, and it was clearly not one day ago. Now Johnny felt that things were getting weirder, and it was time to leave. After leaving the house, he quickly headed to his tent, packed up his things, and left. But on the way back, he was haunted by the thought that he had forgotten something important, something that could explain what had happened in this abandoned place. When Johnny drove out of the abandoned area, the silence inside his car seemed oppressive. The radio was silent. The navigator was not working, as if the technology itself refused to help him escape. He gripped the steering wheel, listening to every sound, as if he was waiting for something to happen. The flashing of the rare road signs outside the window seemed hypnotic, but the thoughts of what he saw did not let go. The note, the fresh footprints in the dust, the figure in the window in the photo. All these are like pieces of a mosaic that Johnny could not put together. After 2 hours of driving, he noticed a gas station and decided to stop to catch his breath. There was not a single person at the gas station, and the building seemed as abandoned as anything he had seen before. Johnny decided to refuel and move on, but when he went to the cash register, the doors were locked and there were no signs of life inside. Another detail that added an unpleasant feeling of unreality to what was happening. Stopping at the car, Johnny looked around. The silence, which had seemed ordinary before, now weighed on my nerves. No cars, no people, no one. And at that moment, he heard footsteps again. Clear, measured steps somewhere around the corner of the building. Johnny walked slowly around the gas station, preparing to see someone who could explain all this. But as he turned the corner, he stumbled into emptiness. There was no one there. But on the ground, right in front of him, there were the same footprints, boot prints that he had already seen earlier. The panic was growing. Someone or something has been watching him all this time. Johnny tried to pull himself together, got into the car, and stepped on the gas. He drove onto the highway and quickly picked up speed. The further away he went, the stronger was the desire to forget about what had happened in the abandoned area and never return there again. However, as he drove through another intersection, he noticed a strange thing. The road ahead, along which he was driving, seemed familiar. He stopped, looked closer, and realized that this was the same intersection that he had passed when he was heading to the abandoned area. Although Johnny was sure he had taken the right turn, the road took him there again. My heart started beating faster. He checked the navigator, but it still refused to work. Johnny felt suddenly weak. It was as if everything around him was talking against him. He couldn't figure out how he ended up in the same place. At that moment, he remembered the note he had found in the house. "We won't have time to escape. If someone finds it." The memory of those words passed through his mind like a lightning bolt. Those who lived here tried to get out, but something prevented them. And now he found himself in the same situation. Johnny started off again, but the road, as if mocking him, led him back to the abandoned streets again. This time he didn't stop. Increasing his speed, he tried to drive as far as possible without looking back. The wind whipped against the windshield, and the dark silhouettes of houses flashed around the edges of vision. But the further he drove, the more he felt that everything around him began to repeat itself. Driving past one of the houses, he slammed on the brakes. This was the house where he had found the note. He drove out onto the same street, as if the circle had closed, and now he had nowhere to go. Johnny felt his palms sweat from the exertion. Something was obviously wrong. He decided to act, get out of the car and look around. The windows of the houses, covered with a layer of dirt and dust, seemed to have been abandoned for a long time. But this particular house stood in front of him as a monument to something lost and unexplored. He headed for the door, the creak of which had been heard in his memory until recently. Suddenly, there was a loud thud in the silence. It was his own breathing, reflecting off the walls of an abandoned building. He went inside the house again, feeling every step echo in the empty rooms. This time, Johnny decided to go around the ground floor more carefully. It seemed to him that something important had escaped him last time. The floors creaked under his weight, and the walls were covered with cracked plaster, like dried wounds. One of the doors led to the basement. It was slightly ajar. The inviting dark opening made it clear that there might be something there that he had not seen before. Johnny froze for a few seconds before making up his mind. The basement turned out to be as empty as everything else in the house, except for one corner where there were old newspapers and wooden boxes covered with a cloth. At first glance, it didn't attract attention, but Johnny knew that such things in places like this were never accidental. He lifted the cloth, and under it he found a number of old documents, photographs, and notes that may have belonged to former residents. Oni's hands were shaking as he began to examine these artifacts of the past. One of the photos depicted a group of people, possibly families, standing in front of a house. At first, everything seemed ordinary, but then something caught his attention. The people in the photo were looking at one point, somewhere in the distance, with tense faces, as if they were expecting something that should not have been. It wasn't a reflection in the window or a shadow, but something about their poses was alarming. It looked like they knew something was going to happen soon. Among the documents, he found a report on strange incidents in the area. They were dated decades ago. People complained about the disappearance of children, unexpected cases of illness, frightening sounds that were heard at night. It was not a mystery, but real facts, confirmed by many residents. The report also pointed to the activities of a certain construction company that was trying to build new residential complexes, but the construction stopped several times. The reason was mysterious. Workers simply stopped coming to work, and those who did stay complained of headaches, strange hallucinations, and even unexplained injuries. Johnny froze, taking in all the information he had found. It became clear to him that this place was not just abandoned. It was entangled in the web of some monstrous mistake. People tried to hide something that had been going on here for years, but all they could do was leave it to rot in the past. He gathered up all the papers, stuffed them into his backpack, and hurried out of the basement. Outside, the air seemed even more oppressive to him. Johnny got in the car and decided he wasn't coming back here, but new questions were spinning in his head. Now he wasn't just wandering the streets, he realized that he had become a part of this story. A story that won't leave him just like that. Johnny drove away from the area, but thoughts of what he had learned would not let go. The road ahead seemed endless, as if he was going nowhere. No sooner had he crossed the city limit than he noticed a car in the rearview mirror. She had been following him for several miles. The dark sedan, showing no intention of overtaking him or slowing down, kept the same distance. Johnny sped up, feeling the muscles in his legs tighten. But the car in the back also picked up speed. He realized that this was not just a coincidence. Someone might have known about his findings and was now trying to stop him. All the documents, all the evidence that he found, should have remained hidden. My brain was frantically searching for a way out of the situation. Johnny knew he couldn't outrun that car. He turned onto a narrow road towards the forest, knowing that this was his only chance to escape. But his pursuer followed him relentlessly. At some point, He had to abruptly turn off the road and drive straight into a dense thicket. Johnny jumped out of the car and hid among the trees, trying not to make a sound. The sedan stopped nearby and two men got out. They didn't look like cops or ordinary people. Their behavior was precise, confident, as if they knew what they were looking for and who they were looking for. Johnny crouched, watching them. The men quickly examined his car and began to look for tracks around. They didn't talk. They acted in silence, like a well-coordinated team. One thing was clear to Johnny: they wouldn't stop until they found him. He realized that everything is much more complicated than just an abandoned neighborhood and old documents. Those who lived in these houses may have faced something much more serious than it might seem. Johnny realized that he had become a part of something that was no longer possible to get out of. Now he wasn't just a witness. He was a target. The men continued to walk around the neighborhood, methodically checking every corner of the forest, every bush, every trace. Johnny was lying on the ground, pressed against the ground so that he could feel its cold through his clothes. Every sound, whether it was the rustle of the wind or the crunch of a dry branch, seemed deafening to him. He knew that if they found him, there would be no way out. His breathing was as quiet as possible. He tried to stay calm, but panic was overwhelming. All he could do was wait, hope for the mistake of those who were looking for him. But there was little time left. The men came closer, their footsteps now sounding so clear that Johnny could make out the weight of their boots on the ground. One of them, taller, stopped just a few meters from his hiding place. He looked around like an animal picking up the trail of its prey. Johnny held his breath, trying to blend in with the shadows of the trees. But luck was not on his side. Suddenly, the phone in his pocket, which he had completely forgotten to turn off, emitted a quiet but treacherously clear signal. A notification about a low battery. The man turned around instantly. His gaze stopped at the spot where Johnny was lying. In the silence of the forest, this sound sounded like a lightning strike, as a signal for action. The man did not hesitate. With cold determination, he went straight to Johnny, snatching a metal object from his belt. Johnny's heart was pounding in his chest as he tried to get to his feet and run. But the branch he stepped on gave way, and he fell before he could take a step. The man was already here. His hands, rough and strong, grabbed Johnny by the collar of his shirt and pulled him up sharply. The seconds stretched into eternity. Johnny knew that the end was near. He tried to shout something, but his voice sank into his chest. Panic had completely taken over him. "Where are the documents?" The man asked softly but threateningly, bringing his face closer to Johnny. He was silent, unable to utter a word. The second man standing nearby took a rope out of his pocket. Johnny realized that his story would end here, in this dark forest, far from the abandoned neighborhood and the old house. No one will know what happened to him. No one will see the evidence he found. All this will disappear with him. His gaze rested on the starry sky, which now seemed so far away and indifferent. The men didn't say a word more. Johnny felt a sharp pain in the back of his head. Then darkness covered him. There are places in the vast American Southwest where people prefer not to look unless absolutely necessary. Vast deserts with sparse withered trees, abandoned trailer parks, and lonely roads stretching through the desert without end. These are territories where time seems to slow down and life stops. The sun scorches the earth during the day, and at night an icy cold descends on it. Sometimes it seems that these places themselves are designed to inspire fear and a sense of loneliness. It was in one of these corners in the middle of endless sands that the story of Jack began, who decided to spend several days here in complete isolation. Jack was a photographer. His fascination with landscapes and wildlife often took him to the most remote corners of the country. He loved to get to places where there were no people, where you could catch a special, untouched time and capture it on film. He went where even the locals didn't go. That was what attracted him the most. One day, he was told about an abandoned farm in the desert. The locals considered this place cursed, but Jack just grinned. He never believed in mysticism and rumors, considering them only the fruit of human fears. However, over the years that he traveled, he learned one thing: The fewer people who want to be in a place, the more interesting shots they can get there. The farm was located far from any populated areas. The road to it was exhausting and long, almost 30 miles over rough terrain, along a dry riverbed, through narrow gorges and endless plains. There are no signs of life except for the occasional old buildings that have long been abandoned by people. One evening, Jack reached his destination. An old farm appeared before him, a small, dilapidated hut with a rickety barn. The walls are covered with a layer of dirt, the windows are broken. It looked as if people had left here suddenly, leaving everything as it was. He settled down for the night in his car, parking it at a safe distance from the farm. The moon was shining brightly, casting shadows on the ground, and Jack decided to explore the area. A noisy but familiar desert wind blew across his face as he took his first steps towards the hut. There was a strange silence in the air, too deep even for this place. The barely audible rustle of sand underfoot and the creaking of old farm planks, no more sounds. As Jack approached the barn, he was attracted by a strange sight. Inside, among the scattered tools and remnants of equipment, he saw something that at first seemed to him the figure of a man. But it wasn't a figure. It was an old hunting skin thrown on the floor. She looked like someone had taken her off an animal quite recently. Local customs or superstitions, he thought. But something about that skin made him uncomfortable. There was a faint smell coming from her, like something long dead, but not completely decayed. On the first night, Jack decided to stay in the car, wrapped in a sleeping bag. He had spent too much time in the wild to trust the huts standing in such places. The night was dark and quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was nearby. The sound of the wind at times resembled muffled footsteps, or the rustle of dry grass, as if someone was slowly approaching his car. But every time he strained to peer into the darkness, nothing happened. The next day, Jack continued to inspect the farm. There was nothing unusual inside the hut, except for a couple of old things left by the old owners. One of them was a diary. The cover was tattered, the pages were yellowed with age. There were traces of handwriting on some of the pages, almost illegible in places. Flipping through it, Jack noticed strange entries. "Today I heard those sounds again. They come at night when everyone is asleep. I'm afraid that if we don't leave here, something will happen. The noise is getting closer. Every time I go out to check, everything goes quiet." Jack suppressed a smile. Another superstition. He put down his diary and decided to take some pictures of the farm at sunset. The shadows falling from the collapsed buildings created perfect compositions. But when he aimed the camera at the hut, it seemed to him that a shadow flashed by the window. He quickly shifted his gaze, but there was no one there. He took a picture, hoping it was just the result of fatigue. At night, when Jack was almost asleep, he was woken up by a sound that seemed strange to him, a muffled tapping, as if someone was scratching the body of a car. He sat up abruptly and listened. The noise stopped. The wind was no longer blowing, and the silence was so dense that it became unbearable. Jack took the flashlight and opened the car door. Nothing, but he saw footprints in the sand around the car. They led away from the barn and disappeared right next to the car. The footprints were indistinct, as if they had been left by a creature on four limbs, but too large for an ordinary animal. The next day, Jack decided to deal with this place once and for all. He took his camera and went to explore the surroundings. The further he went into the desert, the stronger the feeling that someone was watching him. But whenever he looked back, he saw only endless sands. It was already getting dark when he returned to the farm. After taking one last look at the hut, he decided to capture the final shots. But when he held the camera up to his eyes, he froze. A figure stood on the threshold. Jack froze, but realized that it wasn't a human being. It was the same skin that seemed to move on all fours. Jack felt his heart begin to beat faster. The figure at the hut remained motionless, as if frozen in expectation. He tried to focus on her through the lens, zooming in on the camera. Now it was possible to consider a little more details. It was a man, but there was something wrong with his appearance. He was standing in a strange position, leaning forward slightly, as if his body could not support its own weight. Jack put the camera away and froze, listening. There was a frightening silence in the air, broken only by his own breathing. For a moment it occurred to him to get closer, to find out who it was, but something inside stopped him abruptly. His instincts told him it was a bad idea. The figure suddenly began to move. Slowly but surely she stepped forward. Jack took a reflexive step back, his hand going to his belt, where hung the knife he sometimes used for woodwork. The memory of the footprints leading to his car came back to mind. Jack didn't know what he was dealing with, but staying put was stupid. He decided to leave without showing fear. Moving slowly towards the car, Jack tried not to lose sight of the figure. However, she was no longer moving. When he reached the car, quickly closed the door and turned on the engine, the figure began to approach again. Its movements became a little faster, but still unnatural. Like a person with an injury. Jack didn't wait. With a sharp U-turn, he left the farm, kicking up a cloud of dust behind. As he drove along the deserted road, he kept looking around, expecting that figure to reappear somewhere in sight. But apart from the endless sands and lonely rocks, nothing was visible. Leaving the farm far behind, Jack began to come to his senses. But an unpleasant feeling grew inside him that this place would not let him go so easily. When he finally reached the nearest town, the feeling of anxiety subsided a little, but his thoughts were still spinning around those strange events. Jack rented a room in a cheap motel for the night and tried to distract himself by watching the footage on his camera. He suddenly felt uneasy when he came across a picture of the hut taken before he saw the figure. In the photo, in addition to the building itself, a shadow of a man could already be seen at the entrance, but it was so blurred that Jack did not pay attention to it earlier. It was as if that person had been standing there all the time. He just didn't notice him right away. It was as if someone was already watching him long before he realized it. After Jack carefully examined the photo, the feeling of anxiety came over him again. But he tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence. The blurred shadow could be the result of a trick of light or interference on the camera. He closed his laptop, turned off the light, and trying to calm down, went to bed. The knocking was light, insistent, as if someone was trying to get his attention but did not want to wake the other guests. Getting up from the bed, Jack went to the door and cautiously looked through the peephole. Nothing. An empty corridor. He slowly opened the door and looked out. Silence. Cheap wallpaper lined the wall, and an old carpet covered the floor. No sign of people. But as soon as Jack went out into the hallway, he noticed footprints. Barely distinguishable prints were visible on the carpet. Bare footprints leading from his door to the street exit. Jack tensed. It couldn't be a coincidence. He resolutely closed the door and went back inside, trying to figure out what to do next. Leave immediately? But what will it solve? I kept thinking about the strange figure at the cabin, the footprints near his car, and now these footprints are in the motel. It seemed like someone was deliberately trying to make him pay attention to it. And worst of all, Jack didn't understand who was doing it or why. The morning brought only minor relief. Jack decided to go to the local sheriff's office to tell about the strange events, hoping that he would be able to somehow explain what was happening. The sheriff listened to him attentively, but there was disbelief in his eyes. When Jack mentioned the figure and the footprints, the sheriff frowned. "There are tramps here from time to time," he said, interrupting Jack. Local farms and deserts attract people who live outside the law. They may behave strangely, but mostly they are just looking for food or shelter. Perhaps you just came across one of these. Jack knew the sheriff was trying to calm him down, but something about the story didn't add up. Tramps? But how does that explain the footprints in the desert and at the motel? And why did the figure move so strangely, as if it wasn't quite human? The sheriff gave him some on-duty advice on how to better protect his property and car and recommended that he stay away from abandoned places. But this did not satisfy Jack. He left town thinking that there were still no answers, and perhaps more questions than before. Driving past the farm on the way back, Jack didn't stop. He only took one last look at the old hut and realized that this place would always remain with him, not physically, but as something that he would never be able to forget. The farm had become a part of him, some disturbing memory that he would probably never be able to get rid of. Weeks have passed. Jack has returned to his normal life in the city, but something has changed in him. He continued to work and socialize with friends, but his thoughts kept returning to that farm. He had dreams, scenes from the desert, where he saw that strange figure whose silhouette haunted him. The dream was so realistic that when he woke up, he lay in bed for a long time, thinking about what it really was. One day, when Jack returned home after a long day at work, he decided to review all the pictures taken at the farm. He wanted to figure out what happened back then, and maybe find at least some clue. Enough time had passed for his emotions to subside, and now he could calmly analyze everything he saw. Jack opened the folder with the photos on his computer. Flipping through the images one by one, he noticed small details that had escaped his attention at that moment. A shadow by the hut, footprints by the car, blurred silhouettes in the desert. Everything seemed less mysterious than it had then, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave him. And so in one of the pictures, he noticed something strange. Jack zoomed in and held his breath. In the photo taken against the background of the hut, there was a man standing. Now it wasn't a blurred silhouette, it was a clear figure. A stranger standing at the door of the hut and looking directly into the camera. He didn't look like someone Jack had seen before. It was a different person. But the scariest thing was that Jack remembered for sure that when he took this picture, there was no one near the hut. He realized with horror that someone had been there all this time. Someone was watching him while he was taking pictures. The stranger did not try to hide. On the contrary, he deliberately stayed in the frame, as if he wanted Jack to notice him. But who could it be? And how did he end up in all the pictures that Jack just hadn't noticed before? Panic set in, but Jack, despite his fear, tried to keep his sanity. He opened the door and looked out into the hallway. Empty. Just like that night at the motel. But now he knew that someone was watching him. That night, he packed up and left his house. The endless feeling of being watched made him not stay in place. Jack thought that by leaving, he would be able to leave these oddities behind. But as he left the city, he couldn't get rid of the thought that the same stranger was still watching him somewhere nearby. This man was real, and maybe he was a lot closer now than Jack could have imagined. A group of friends have long dreamed of thrills, and this time they decided to spend the night in a house about which there were terrible rumors. This house was considered an ordinary urban legend. People talked about strange sounds, disappearances, and incomprehensible phenomena that allegedly took place here. But the friends did not believe in the supernatural. They decided to prove to themselves and others that there is no horror in abandoned places. That night they gathered in an old, long-abandoned mansion, which stood on the outskirts of the city, overgrown with dense trees and hidden from human eyes. The house had not been visited for a long time, and its very appearance was frightening. Broken windows, a roof overgrown with moss, and doors that seemed ready to fall at the slightest touch. However, their plan was simple: to spend the night in this place and prove to everyone in the morning that there is no mysticism. But tonight, they were going to learn that fear doesn't always come in the form you expect it to. When they entered the house, their first thought was how long it had been abandoned. The dim light of the lanterns only accentuated the peeling walls and scattered glass fragments on the floor. No one paid attention to the slight chill that crept along their backs, blaming it on drafts. They settled into the former living room, laying out sleeping bags and joking with each other about spirits that can appear at night. But soon, oddities began to happen. One of them heard the creaking of the floorboards on the second floor, but attributed it to the old age of the house. The smell of rot was gradually increasing in the air, as if something vile was decomposing somewhere very close by. But what started as jokes soon became something much more sinister. When James, one of his friends, suggested exploring the house, others supported his idea. They began to look around the rooms, but the further they went, the stronger the feeling that someone was watching them. In one of the bedrooms, they found an old diary, the entries of which evoked eerie associations. We hear them at night. They move along the walls. There's no way out. But that didn't stop them. When they got to the basement, the situation became really dangerous. The basement was not empty, as they had expected. There were old, dust-covered shelves with ancient tools and, what surprised them the most, strange metal cages that seemed to be used for something creepy. But the scariest thing was that on one of the walls there was a fresh mark from something sharpened, as if someone had recently tried to get out. When they returned to the living room, their companion, Laura, had disappeared. In a panic, they started looking for her, but soon realized that the house seemed to have changed. The corridors were getting longer, the doors that had been locked before were now open, and the rooms seemed to be moving. The walls were covered with strange footprints, as if someone or something was moving behind them. The fear became unbearable. They realized that a night in this house was far from a joke, and something that lived here had long ago chosen new victims for itself. When Laura disappeared, everything in the house began to feel different. At first, the guys thought that she just decided to make fun of them by hiding somewhere, but the minutes dragged on and she was not visible. First a little excitement, then panic, and now James was shouting her name, running around every corner. No answers. The house, despite all its abandonment, seemed to be coming to life. Every little thing suddenly seemed ominous. The creaking floor, the soft sounds of dripping water, the trembling curtains that moved in the draft. Sam was the first to notice something strange. He went to an old closet in the hallway, near the stairs, and noticed fresh fingerprints on the dusty surface. They were thin, as if they belonged to a child, and they reached for one of the drawers. At first it seemed funny to him. How could there be fresh footprints here? But then he had a vague suspicion that they were not alone here. "It's just someone's stupid joke," James said, although there was uncertainty in his voice. Maybe Laura just decided to scare us. However, no one saw how she could have evaporated so quickly. There was only one exit in the living room, and through it they would have noticed if she had left. "We should split up and look for her," Sarah suggested, but her suggestion was met with silent resistance. "Split up? Are you serious?" Sam chuckled nervously. "After all this? We have to stick together." They began to explore the house with renewed caution. The tension was palpable. Every step seemed louder. Every creak made them turn around in anticipation of something terrible. The house was obviously old. Perhaps someone before them had used it for some dark business, but they tried not to dwell on it. Every time someone suggested going back to the living room, another part of the group insisted on looking for Laura. They began to inspect the second floor, and it was there that the situation changed dramatically. In one of the rooms, which had previously been locked, they found torn sheets hanging from the bed and strange streaks on the floor, as if someone was dragging something heavy across it. James bent down to get a better look and realized that these were footprints, bare, dirty feet going into the hallway. "It's just Laura trying to scare us," James said again, but there was no longer that confidence in his voice. He didn't believe his own words. Nevertheless, they followed the tracks that led to the old storeroom. When they opened the door, a strong smell of mold and something rotten hit them in the nose. They saw Laura's torn sweatshirt on the floor, as if it had been thrown in a hurry. That was the last time they saw her stuff. They began to realize that the situation was beyond their control. Every minute in this house turned into a nerve-wracking ordeal. It was getting harder to breathe. Fear was literally pressing on my chest. And then Sam, who had not left the door, saw a shadow appear in the doorway. He rushed to the exit, trying to get them out. But the door, which used to open easily, is now jammed. It seemed that the house was holding them, and no one was going to leave. "We have to find something to knock her out," James shouted. In a panic, they started looking for something heavy that could help. But the more they searched, the more small details began to surface. The house was full of things that indicated that someone had lived here recently. Yellowed newspapers on the kitchen table, an unfinished cup of coffee, old but clean blankets on the couch. "Someone was here recently," Sarah managed, her voice trembling. "But where did they go?" And then Sam noticed an old wooden door under the stairs, which had previously been hidden behind a closet. She looked so insignificant that they didn't even notice her. Without a word, they walked up to it and opened it with difficulty. They saw a narrow staircase leading down to an even darker part of the basement. "Are you kidding?" James said, stepping back. "We're not going there." But there was no choice. They all realized that, most likely, that's where Laura is. Or what's left of her. They went downstairs, and with each step the air grew colder, as if the whole house was breathing icy fear. When they reached the basement, the dim light of the lanterns picked out metal cages from the darkness. Their guesses were confirmed. It was something like imprisonment. But the scariest thing was that some of the cages were open, and there were signs of a struggle inside. There were pieces of clothing, hair, and blood on the floor. "Oh my God, what happened here?" Sarah whispered, trying not to faint. But the worst was yet to come. When they reached one of the cages, the door closed behind them with a loud hum. James rushed to the exit, but the door was locked on the other side. Heavy footsteps sounded in the darkness. Someone or something was slowly approaching them from the far corner of the basement. There was no time to shout, argue, or panic. All they knew was that if they didn't get out right now, no one else would know what had happened to them. They grabbed an old crowbar that was lying against the wall and began pounding on the door with force. Each new attempt brought them more and more despair, because the steps were getting closer. There were soft footsteps outside the door. Someone or something was standing there. And at that moment, James hit the crowbar again, and the door finally gave way. They flew out, ran without looking back. The night wrapped them in a cold wind, but it was the wind of freedom. The house was left behind. Its walls hid the mystery of what happened that night. But the scariest thing was that they never found Laura. They climbed out and breathed in the cold night air with relief. Thick darkness surrounded them from all sides, but compared to what they had experienced inside the house, it seemed like a real salvation. No one said a word. Everyone was trying to make sense of what had happened. The same question was in their minds. Where had Laura gone? James broke the silence first. "We have to go back for her. We can't just walk away." Sam looked at him with wild eyes. "Come back? Are you crazy? This house is a trap. We barely made it out on our own. Do you want to go back in there?" Sarah, trembling, moved aside and sat down on a fallen tree. Her fingers were trembling, and she was staring straight ahead, not focusing on anything. "She could be dead," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe her words. These words hung in the air as if they were thinking about it, but didn't dare to say it. James looked at the dark building behind them. It stood motionless, like a cold and dead monolith, giving no answers. But James knew one thing. They couldn't leave without trying to find her, even if it's the last thing they do. "We can't just leave," he said firmly. "If we don't come back, she'll be left there, alone." Sam was torn between the instinct of salvation and guilt. He wanted to leave this place as soon as possible, but everything inside screamed that leaving Laura was wrong, and it was this conflict that was tearing him apart. "All right," Sam finally agreed, "but only if we go together and stay close, not a step aside." They understood that there was no time to argue. It was dangerous to delay, and every lost moment could cost Laura her life if she was still alive. They headed back to the house. This time, their footsteps were more cautious, each sound causing tension. The house no longer seemed lifeless to them. He seemed to be watching them. When they were inside again, the air seemed to thicken with fear. They tried to stay close, but every corner, every sound was now perceived as a threat. The corridors, which had seemed simple and short before, seemed to stretch out, as if they were deliberately confusing them. All the little things they had noticed before seemed insignificant, but now every item was suspicious. They went upstairs, where they first lost Laura. The whole room where her sweater was found seemed even more creepy now. The smell of rot increased, although there was nothing visible. Sarah first went to the place where they had seen the footprints, and noticed a strange grinding noise coming from the wall. "There's something here," she whispered. The others came up to her, and James ran his hand along the wall. He stopped when he came across something hard and unusually cold. It was a metal plate embedded in the wall. Their hearts froze when they realized that this was not just an interior detail. It was a disguised entrance. "It looks like a secret passage," Sam muttered. James, without hesitation, began groping for how to open the plate. A few minutes later, the door creaked open, and a narrow shaft leading down opened in front of them. The thin light of the flashlights picked out dust and cobwebs, giving the impression that this passage had not been used for many years. But the traces of fresh dirt on the floor suggested otherwise. "That's where we're going," James said shortly, clutching the flashlight in his hand so that his fingers turned white. They went down into an underground tunnel leading somewhere under the house. The walls here were made of rough concrete, and it looked like the passage had been dug out by hand. The further they went, the colder and wetter it became. Water dripped from the ceiling, creating a monotonous, unnerving sound that mixed with their breathing. "Whoever it is, he doesn't want to be found," Sam whispered, looking around. The tunnel suddenly widened, and they found themselves in a huge basement, resembling a vault or an abandoned shelter. There were several doors here, and they froze, not knowing where to go. James went to the first door, but it was locked. Sarah noticed something that made her freeze. Crumpled pieces of paper lay on the floor, against one of the walls. She picked one up and saw that they were notes written in a hasty and trembling hand. The notes clearly belonged to different people, who may have once tried to get out of this place. "We've been here for 3 days now. There are not enough supplies. There are only walls and these steps around. No one comes out alive. This place keeps us trapped. We don't know who or what it is. They come at night, but no one comes back. There is a way out here, but we don't know where it leads. No one has returned." Sarah couldn't believe her eyes. These people that no one knew about, they found themselves in the same situation here, just like they are now. "We can't stay here," Sam said, reading the notes over his shoulder. "We need to find her and leave as soon as possible." They moved down the corridor, opening the doors one by one. The rooms were empty, except for some old objects lying around, long forgotten and covered with a layer of dust. They finally found her in one of the rooms. Laura was lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. They knew it was a bad day for the trip, but it was too late to turn back. The friends met for the first time in a long time and decided to go on vacation. It was a foggy evening, and on the way they had to drive through a deserted section, an abandoned part of the highway that had long been excluded from the main routes. Once it was an ordinary road, but over time, traffic almost stopped here due to accidents and disappearances that began to occur too often. Michael, Sam and Rebecca were sitting in the car, exchanging hilarious jokes. They were sure that their path was just a short cut through a forgotten place, and soon they would find themselves on the main highway. But instead, the emptiness of the highway around them began to seem endless. Not a single streetlight, not a single oncoming car. Only the gray sky, heavy with clumps of fog, and the road that stretched like an endless ribbon before their eyes. "I think we're lost," Rebecca said anxiously, staring at the GPS. "His signal is gone here." "Nonsense, it's just temporary," grinned Michael, the driver and the main optimist of the group. "Let's just drive on. I'm sure we'll find some gas station soon." But there was no gas station. The road remained dead. Time passed, and now the night began to thicken outside the window. Finally, Sam suggested, "Can we stop? I have a feeling that we missed something." Michael reluctantly slowed down. They all got out of the car, looking around. Silence. Even the wind was not blowing, and the air seemed heavy and humid. There was no sound, no sign of life, just an old road that looked like it hadn't been used for decades. "This place," Sam began, but Rebecca interrupted him. "Look," she pointed to something ahead, around a bend in the road. A dim light loomed in the distance, as if from lanterns or a small house. Hope flashed across their faces. "Let's go there? Maybe there's someone there who can help us," Michael said, getting back behind the wheel. As they approached, the light became more distinct. It was an old roadside motel, half demolished but still with a semblance of work. 20 years ago, such places could be found on any highway. Small, cozy rooms where tired travelers stayed overnight. But now the motel looked like a forgotten relic from another time, with dim lights and peeling paint on the walls. "At least the lights are on," Rebecca said with cautious relief. They got out of the car and headed for the front door. The doorbell was ringing when Michael opened the door. Inside was a reception room, furnished with old furniture and old photographs on the walls. A middle-aged man with a tired face that almost blended into the shabby walls was sitting at the counter. He looked at them without showing much interest. "Do you need a room?" His voice was as tired as he was. "Yes, if I may," Michael replied, looking around. "We need to stop for one night. It seems that we have lost our way a little." "You're not the only ones who come here by accident," the man said. His words sounded strange, but Michael just nodded. "Do you have any rooms available?" Rebecca asked, trying to hide her anxiety. The man looked at them for a little longer than politeness required, but then nodded and handed them the key to one of the rooms. "Take the second floor, room 12. Only, the door may jam, so try not to pull too hard." Michael took the key and thanked the man. The three of them headed for the stairs, which creaked under their feet. The walls of the motel seemed old, shabby, and it seemed like they hadn't seen a renovation in a long time. Room 12 turned out to be tiny, with a dirty carpet and an old wooden wardrobe. There was a damp smell in the air, as if it hadn't been aired in ages. Rebecca opened the window, trying to let in some fresh air, but even outside the air was stuffy and still. The motel was far away from everything, and not a single sound of civilization reached their ears. "Okay, it's not 5 stars, but at least a roof over your head," Michael tried to joke, throwing his things on the bed. They decided that the best thing they could do was go to bed and hit the road in the morning. But as soon as night fell, something began to change. Sam couldn't sleep. A strange feeling of anxiety wouldn't let him go. He tried to turn over several times, but each time a creak attracted his attention. At first it was the creaking of the floorboards under their feet. Then it was as if someone was quietly walking in the corridor outside the door. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, sitting up on the bed. "What?" Rebecca replied, stretching sleepily. "There's someone walking in the hallway. Maybe it's that weird motel owner." Michael muttered, but he listened too. The footsteps outside the door grew louder and heavier, as if someone was wandering back and forth, sometimes stopping right at their door. Sam got up, and without turning on the light, slowly walked to the door, pressing his ear to the tree. Fear was building inside him, but he couldn't figure out what exactly was bothering him. This place, this night, everything seemed wrong. Michael also came to the door, trying to convince Sam that it was just their imagination. He slowly turned the handle and opened the door. The dark corridor turned out to be empty, but the feeling of the presence of something strange did not let go. "Nothing, it's empty," Michael said, but then his gaze fell to the floor. The thin layer of dust that covered everything around clearly showed traces. There was a clear print of a bare foot right in front of their door. Michael and Sam exchanged glances. It couldn't be a figment of their imagination. The footprints were too real. The dirty prints of bare feet went along the corridor and were lost in the semi-darkness. Contrary to logic, they decided to check where they were going. Michael, although skeptical, realized that this was no longer a joke. Rebecca came closer, asking in a trembling voice, "Maybe you don't need to?" "I don't like it." But Michael had already stepped into the hallway. The heavy air pressed down on them, as if the walls of the old motel were not just aging. They seemed to shrink, getting tighter with every step. The dim light of the lamps barely illuminated the way, and only the creaking of the wooden floorboards reminded them that they were still here in reality. "Are you coming?" Michael asked Sam, who was still standing in the doorway of the room. "Yes, but there's something wrong here, Michael. We don't even know who it could be." "Maybe it's the guy from the reception desk," Michael replied, but there was no certainty in his voice. "Let's just take a look and come back." They moved slowly forward, following a corridor lit only by the uneven light of old lamps. Footprints in the dust led down the stairs. The staircase, which had seemed old during the day, now looked almost frightening. Every step of it echoed in the dead building. They went downstairs, but when they got to the lobby, it was empty. The man who was sitting at the counter disappeared. The counter itself seemed even more abandoned than during the day, as if no one had been here for many years. "Maybe he went to sleep?" Sam suggested, but his voice was full of doubt. Michael looked around, but his gaze stopped on the wall behind the counter. He hadn't paid attention to her before, but now something seemed strange. There was a small board with room keys on the wall, but one key was strangely highlighted. Instead of the usual iron keychain, an old yellowed note was tied to it. Michael came closer and, unable to resist curiosity, took the note in his hands. On it, in barely discernible ink, was written, "Never open room 7. If you're here, run." Sam came closer, his eyes widening. "Is this some kind of joke?" "What is it?" he asked, but Michael didn't answer. At that moment, there was a slight creaking sound behind them, as if a door had opened somewhere. They both turned at the sound and saw that the door leading to the back hallway was barely ajar. At first, they saw nothing but darkness, but then the door slowly swung open a little more, and a shadow appeared behind it. It was not a human figure, but rather something indistinct, like movement in the dark that could not be accurately described. Both of them suddenly had dry throats, and they felt their backs go cold. "We have to get out of here," Sam whispered hoarsely, backing away. But Michael stood his ground. His gaze was fixed on the hallway. He felt an inexplicable attraction to that door, as if something was calling him there, forcing him to take a step forward. Sam had already grabbed his arm, but Michael seemed paralyzed by this eerie, gloomy corridor that led into the unknown. Meanwhile, Rebecca, who remained in the room, began to realize that the guys were staying too long. Deciding that something was wrong, she dressed and went to look for them. She saw them standing at the bottom, frozen in front of a strange, slightly open door. "What are you guys doing there?" she called out to them as she went down the stairs. But when she came closer and also saw that shadow outside the door, her face turned pale. Something about this place was completely wrong. It was as if the building itself, this motel, was pulling them into its walls, forcing them to stay here forever. "Michael, let's get out of here," Rebecca almost shouted. "I don't want to be here anymore." Suddenly, the door at the end of the corridor slammed sharply. The noise was so loud that for a moment everyone's ears were blocked. Michael seemed to wake up from his stupor. He looked at Sam and Rebecca with a look of horror on his face. "We have to leave, now." They hurriedly headed back to their room, where their belongings were still left. Going up to the second floor, they heard a thud from the back of the building. Someone or something was clearly moving along the corridors behind them. The noise grew louder and closer. When they finally got to their room, Sam tried to lock the door, but the door, as the receptionist had warned, was jammed. Tugging at the handle, he finally slammed it shut. But suddenly, there was a rattling sound all over the room. The windows began to shake, as if someone was hitting the glass from outside. "We're not alone here," Rebecca whispered, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. At that moment, Sam suddenly turned around and saw something in the corner of the room that he hadn't noticed before. In the shadow between the wardrobe and the bed stood an old, worn suitcase. But the strangest thing was that it was locked with a rusty lock with a broken key, but it had obviously moved recently. There was no layer of dust around the suitcase on the floor. "This suitcase, it wasn't here before," he whispered, leaning closer. The suitcase was obviously old, but it looked like it had been touched recently. Sam touched it carefully, but the moment his fingers touched the lock, an icy draft swept through the room, and the door swung open abruptly. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and a cold wind rushed into the room, causing the windows to shake and the objects on the shelves to brush against each other. Sam, Rebecca, and Michael froze in horror, unable to take their eyes off the opening door. There was a man standing in the doorway, or what had once been a man. His face was distorted, his eyes soulless, and his clothes were torn and dirty. His feet were bare, and his feet were covered with traces of dirt and something else, obviously not human. "Please," he said faintly, taking a step forward at the same time. "You have to get out of here. This is not your place." Rebecca screamed and jumped back against the back wall, while Michael and Sam were paralyzed, not knowing what to do. It couldn't be real. This man looked like a ghost from their worst nightmares. "Who are you?" Michael asked, but his voice was shaking. "I was here for so long," the strange man said, and his voice sounded as if it came from the distant past. His words were like a spell. "I got lost, and now I can't leave. You need to run while there is still time." Sam, terrified, slipped to the window looking for a way out, but there was only darkness outside the window. They were trapped. "It's just a man," Michael shouted, trying to keep his cool. "Maybe he's just confused like us." "No, "It's not," Rebecca protested, her voice full of fear. "He's warning us. We have to leave." At that moment, the creaking sound was heard again. This time, it came from the corner of the room where the suitcase was standing. It was as if someone had tried to open it, and the lock couldn't stand the load. There was a clang of metal and a sharp click as the suitcase opened. Inside, there were things that once belonged to travelers, scraps of clothing, old letters, and photographs. However, there was something else among them, a dirty notebook that someone started filling out until something terrible happened. Rebecca came closer, trying to make out the text written in a worn pen. She bent over the notebook, and the words written on it made her hold her breath. "If you are reading this, then you are already here. There is no way out here, only the end. They're taking you away one by one." The words seemed to jump out of the page, as if they were trying to tell them what to do. They exchanged glances, and at that moment, everything became clear. What they thought was a simple motel was actually a place where people disappeared and no one could get out. Their hearts were pounding in unison, and they realized that maybe their time was running out. "Let's go now," Sam shouted, grabbing Michael's arm. "We have to get out." The creaking of footsteps sounded again, but now it sounded closer. Rebecca's legs felt like cotton wool, and she clutched at her suitcase, trying to figure out what to do. But the more she looked at the notes and things, the more a strange feeling came over her. This suitcase seems to have belonged to those who came here before them. She pulled out one of the pieces of clothing and saw the name on it, Dave. "It's not just a motel," she said, but her voice was shaking. "It's a trap." Sam turned toward the door when movement caught his attention. The open door began to creak again, and the man with the distorted face appeared in the doorway. "They're coming for you." "Stop it," he shouted. "You need to run. They won't stop until they pick you up." Michael rushed to the door, but the man suddenly grabbed his shoulder, and his face became very close. "Get out of here. I can't stop them. Don't let them catch you." His eyes were filled with horror, and there was a warning in them. Sam, seeing that Michael couldn't move, rushed to the door and pushed the man. He fell to the floor, but soon got up, and his face was distorted with fear again. "Please don't stay," he screamed, and then abruptly jerked towards the window. "They're coming." Without realizing how it happened, they found themselves outside, the air filled with the scent of dampness and rot. The silence enveloped them like a veil, and only the sounds of their own hearts resounded in the silence. They looked back at the motel. The dark windows, like black holes, looked like someone was looking at them. And then the silence was broken again. A sharp creak made them freeze. The man came out of the motel door again, but now he was different. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of madness. He was pointing them in the direction of the woods, which began right behind the motel. "Run!" he shouted, and his cry was filled with insane despair. They didn't wait. Their inner instinct told them to run, to escape from this place, from this curse. The forest seemed dark and impenetrable, but it didn't have the horror that the motel held. They ran, not knowing where, just to get away from this place. Yet the further they went, the more fear grew. The feeling of persecution did not leave them. They slipped past the trees, trying not to trip over the roots, but at the same time, they felt that someone was still watching them. Suddenly, Sam turned around and saw a shadow that swept past them, as if something sinister was rushing in their direction. He screamed, "Hurry up!" They were running past the trees when, suddenly, Rebecca stumbled and fell to the ground. But at that moment, she heard something whispering in the branches. "Rebecca!" Michael and Sam shouted, but she was already fainting from fear. The moment she looked up, she saw a figure standing right in front of her, from behind the trees. For a moment it seemed that he was just a man, but then she noticed something in his gaze that resembled thirst for souls. "Don't look at him," Sam shouted, but it was too late. Rebecca froze, her gaze fixed on the figure in front of her. It was the same man they had seen at the motel, but now he was different. His face, disfigured and full of pain, reflected the horror he was clearly experiencing. His eyes, as if they had absorbed all the light around them, looked straight at her without blinking. Michael and Sam rushed to Rebecca, but their legs felt like cotton wool. The ground beneath them seemed viscous, as if they were running through a swamp in which every step became more and more difficult. Heavy breathing sounded in his ears, and cold sweat streamed down his back. "Rebecca!" Sam shouted, but his voice sounded far away, as if the earth itself was absorbing his scream. The figure stood motionless, as if it were part of the forest. The man's face twisted into a terrible grimace. His lips parted, but no words were heard. Only the silence of the forest, piercing every cell of the body, made the moment unbearable. Rebecca began to slowly get to her feet, but she couldn't take her eyes off the stranger. He held out his hand as if calling her to him. Her body refused to obey. Her legs seemed rooted to the ground. A small voice sounded in my head. "Come here. You have to. They'll be picking you up soon." This voice was not her own. It was not real, but still she felt it as if it came from the very earth. "Run away!" Michael screamed in desperation, and it seemed to snap her out of her stupor. Rebecca jerked back, falling to her knees and trying to push off the ground. At the same moment, the figure took off from its place, as if it were part of some crazy plan, and rushed towards her. Time seemed to have stopped. Sam rushed to her, grabbed her arm, and pulled her towards him. Michael ran from behind, looking back at this figure, which was rapidly approaching, but its movements were unnaturally fast, as if it did not touch the ground. "Hurry up! He's catching up." They ran like they had never run in their lives. The forest around them grew denser, the trees seemed taller, and the ground beneath their feet became more uneven. But neither Sam nor Michael stopped. Every step was on the verge of despair. The sounds of the chase were getting closer. Footsteps, breathing, something that could not be described in words but was clearly chasing them. Finally, they ran out into the clearing. The air was heavy. They were suffocating from fatigue, but the pursuit did not stop. The forest behind them seemed endless, and the darkness that reigned in it seemed to be watching them. They turned around, and their gazes stopped at the edge of the forest. The shadow that was chasing them froze at the very edge of the clearing, as if it was connected to the forest, unable to go beyond it. Why did he stop? Michael croaked, breathing heavily and looking at the figure. The figure stood motionless, its silhouette disappearing into the darkness of the trees. There was a kind of hatred in his eyes, but also despair. Michael took a few steps back, making sure that no one else came closer to the forest. "What now?" Rebecca asked in a broken voice, still in shock from what had happened. At that moment, they realized that they did not know where they were. The clearing was completely surrounded by forest, but the path they were running along was no longer visible. All three figures froze in the center of the clearing, and it began to dawn on them that they were not saved, but only temporarily sheltered from the horror that awaited them in the forest. "We have to get out of here. Find our way back," Sam said softly, but his voice was shaking. He felt that they were still being watched. Rebecca asked, her voice almost breaking into a sob. "We don't even know where we are. We can't go back there." Michael scanned the clearing carefully, and his gaze stopped at an old abandoned building that was barely visible among the trees on the opposite side. It looked like a dilapidated house, long forgotten and overgrown with vines, but it was the only shelter they could find in this hell. "We have to go there," he pointed at the building. "Maybe there's a phone there, or at least a place to hide." Sam and Rebecca looked at him, and although the idea didn't seem good, they had no other options. The shadows behind them began to move slowly.
The end is here. It wraps its cold fingers around us all eventually, but some meet their end sooner than others. Tonight, we delve into the abyss of the unknown, exploring the darkest corners of human experience. Are you brave enough to face the darkness? Nestled in the musty halls of an aging hotel lies room 104. This room, shrouded in mystery and whispers, has a history that sends shivers down the spine of even the bravest souls. On the surface, it seems like any other room: faded wallpaper, a flickering lamp, the faint scent of mildew. Yet there's an unsettling aura that clings to the air, a sense of foreboding that one can't quite shake off. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, something sinister festers. The room seems to breathe with a life of its own, shadows dancing in the corners, whispering secrets of the past. Guests reported strange occurrences, whispers in the dead of night, cold spots, and fleeting glimpses of a figure lurking in the corner of their eyes. These experiences were not mere figments of imagination, but shared by many who dared to stay. They would leave, shaken and disturbed, their vacations cut short by an unspoken dread. The fear etched on their faces told stories of sleepless nights and an overwhelming urge to escape. The hotel staff dismissed their claims as overactive imaginations. They would smile politely, assuring guests that nothing was amiss, but behind their eyes a flicker of doubt lingered. But the disappearances couldn't be explained away so easily. Posters of missing persons began to adorn the walls, each face a haunting reminder of those who vanished. One by one, guests who dared to spend the night in room 104 vanished without a trace, their belongings left behind, untouched, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The police investigated, but the room offered no clues, no signs of struggle. It was as if the room itself had swallowed them whole, leaving no evidence of their existence. It was as if they had been swallowed whole, their existence erased from reality. The bed remained perfectly made, the room eerily undisturbed, a chilling testament to the unknown. Room 104 remained sealed shut, a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of the ordinary. The door, now marked with police tape, stood as a silent guardian of its secrets. For those who dare to cross the threshold, a fate far worse than death may await. The room beckons, a siren call to the curious and the brave, but its embrace is cold and unforgiving. On the outskirts of a forgotten town stands the silhouette of what was once known as Cranbrook Mental Asylum. Now it's a decaying monument to human suffering, a place where the echoes of madness still linger. The asylum's history is woven with threads of pain, despair, and experimental treatments that would make your blood run cold. Urban explorers venture into its depths, hoping to capture a glimpse of the supernatural. Many claim to have encountered her, the ghost of a nurse driven mad by the horrors she witnessed. Her white uniform, stained with what looks like blood, flits through the decaying corridors, her mournful cries echoing through the empty wards. Cold spots, sudden drops in temperature, and malfunctioning electronic equipment are common occurrences. The abandoned asylum is not just haunted, it's a living, breathing entity, feeding off the fear of those foolish enough to enter its domain. Cranbrook stands as a chilling reminder that some places hold on to their darkness long after the lights have gone out. In the realm of the macabre, there exists a breed of objects that inspire fear and unease. Cursed dolls. These dolls, often found in the most unexpected places, carry with them a history of malevolence and dread. This is the story of one such doll, its porcelain face frozen in a perpetual sneer, its eyes seeming to follow your every move. The doll's expression, a mix of malice and mockery, seemed to pierce through the very soul of anyone who dared to look at it. It was discovered in the attic of a dilapidated Victorian mansion, its tiny hands clutching a faded handwritten note that simply read, "She's mine now." The attic, filled with dust and cobwebs, seemed to echo with the whispers of the past, adding to the doll's eerie presence. The antique dealer who found the doll thought nothing of it and sold it to a young woman, an avid collector of antique toys. She was thrilled with her find, unaware of the dark history that accompanied it. From the moment the doll crossed the threshold of her home, a palpable darkness descended. The once warm and inviting home now felt cold and unwelcoming. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The woman began to experience vivid nightmares, plagued by images of the doll coming to life. Each night the dreams grew more intense, the doll's sneer more sinister, as if it was feeding off her fear. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered ominously, and whispers seemed to emanate from the very walls. The whispers, barely audible, spoke of secrets and curses, driving the woman to the brink of madness. Her sanity started to unravel, her grip on reality loosening with each passing day. She could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a product of her tormented mind. One evening, the woman's neighbours, alarmed by her screams, called the police. They had heard her cries for help, her pleas for the torment to end, and feared for her safety. They arrived to find her huddled in a corner, eyes wide with terror, pointing a shaking finger at the doll. The sight of the woman, broken and terrified, was enough to convince the officers that something was terribly wrong. The doll was removed from the home and locked away. But the strange occurrences continued. The woman, though relieved to be rid of the doll, could still feel its presence as if it had left a part of itself behind. The cursed doll remains a chilling reminder that some toys are better left untouched, some evils better left undisturbed. It now sits in a dark room, untouched and undisturbed, a silent testament to the horrors it once unleashed. Along desolate highways and lonely stretches of road, a chilling legend persists. The legend of the phantom hitchhiker. A solitary figure, often a young woman, thumb outstretched, seeking a ride into the night. Her story is as old as time itself, a cautionary tale whispered from one traveller to another. It begins innocently enough, a lone driver on a dark road, headlights illuminating the figure of a hitchhiker. Compassion compels the driver to stop, to offer a helping hand to a stranger in need. The hitchhiker is always polite, soft-spoken and grateful for the ride. But as the miles pass, a sense of unease settles over the driver. The hitchhiker speaks in riddles, their words laced with cryptic warnings. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanish, leaving behind only an empty seat and a lingering sense of dread. Encounters with the phantom hitchhiker are always unsettling, often terrifying and sometimes deadly. So the next time you're driving alone on a dark road, think twice before you offer a ride. Deep in the heart of ancient forests, where sunlight struggles to penetrate the dense canopy, there lurks an entity as old as time itself, the shadow in the woods. This shadowy figure has been the subject of countless tales and legends passed down through generations, each adding a layer of mystery and fear. It is a creature of darkness, a manifestation of our deepest fears. The shadow in the woods embodies the unknown, the unseen, and the unexplainable, making it a powerful symbol of the primal fear that resides within us all. Those who dare to venture into its domain speak of a feeling of being watched, of an unseen presence that follows their every move. The air grows colder, and the forest seems to close in around them, amplifying their sense of dread. The shadow in the woods is often described as a tall, humanoid figure shrouded in darkness. Its form is elusive, always just out of clear sight, blending seamlessly with the shadows of the trees. Some say it has glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness like embers in a dying fire, while others claim it has no face at all, just an empty void that absorbs all light. There are stories of hikers who have strayed from the path, lured deeper into the woods by an unseen force. These tales often end in tragedy, with the lost never to be seen again, swallowed by the forest's depth. The world is a tapestry of shadows and light. We cling to the light, seeking comfort in its familiarity. But deep down, we know the truth. The darkness is always there, lurking just beyond our vision, waiting for its moment to consume us. This is a journey into that darkness, a descent into the heart of our deepest fears, where ancient legends intertwine with modern horrors. We will explore the chilling reality of skinwalkers, those malevolent creatures of Navajo legend that stalk the night. We will confront the unsettling terror that clowns with their painted smiles and empty eyes can evoke. and we will delve into the sterile halls of hospitals where the line between life and death blurs and restless spirits linger. Prepare yourself, for what you're about to read is not for the faint of heart. These are the scariest true horror stories of the year. Stories that will stay with you long after you turn the final page. Stories that will make you question the darkness that surrounds you and the darkness that resides within. In the heart of the Navajo Nation, beneath the unforgiving sun and the vast star-studded sky, whispers a legend as old as time itself. It speaks of the skinwalkers, malevolent creatures that roam the night cloaked in the skins of animals. They are shapeshifters, witches, the embodiment of evil. The Navajo people, steeped in centuries of tradition and wisdom, treat the skinwalkers with a fear that borders on reverence. To speak their name aloud is to invite their attention, to draw them closer. But stories persist. Tales whispered around campfires, passed down through generations, each more chilling than the last. Some say the skinwalkers were once medicine men, their knowledge twisted and corrupted by dark magic. Others believe they are vengeful spirits forever bound to the earthly realm. Whatever their origin, one thing is certain: to encounter a skinwalker is to invite terror into your life. The reservation is a tapestry of mesas and canyons, painted in hues of red and gold. But as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, a palpable sense of dread settles over the Navajo Nation. This is when the skinwalkers hunt. There are stories of solitary travelers, their cars breaking down on deserted stretches of highway, only to be stalked by something inhuman, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Ranchers whisper of livestock mutilated with surgical precision, their bodies drained of blood. And families huddled around flickering fires speak in hushed tones of the sounds they hear at night: the eerie howl of a coyote, too close to be natural, the unsettling sound of footsteps padding silently outside their homes. One particular story sends chills down the spines of even the bravest Navajo. It tells of a young couple driving home from a celebration in the next town. As they rounded a bend in the road, their headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was tall and gaunt, covered in what looked like animal hide. Its eyes, glowing an unnatural yellow, seemed to pierce through the windshield, instilling a primal fear in their hearts. The couple slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the creature. For a moment it stared at them, its silence more terrifying than any scream. Then, with a speed that defied logic, it darted into the darkness, disappearing into the night. The couple, shaken to their core, sped away, the image of the creature seared into their minds. These stories, passed down through generations, serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks at the edges of our world. The skinwalkers are real, and they are waiting. The image of a clown is meant to evoke joy, laughter, and a sense of childlike wonder. But for many, the sight of a clown triggers a primal fear, a deep-seated unease that defies rational explanation. Perhaps it's the painted smiles, frozen in a grotesque parody of happiness, or the eyes, hidden behind layers of makeup, their true intentions obscured. Whatever the reason, there's no denying the unsettling power that clowns hold over our collective psyche. This fear, known as coulrophobia, is more common than you might think. And for some, it's rooted in real-life encounters with clowns that were anything but funny. From the infamous case of John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer who lured his victims while dressed as Pogo the Clown, to the wave of creepy clown sightings that terrorized communities across the globe, clowns have earned their place in the pantheon of horror. The park was deserted, the swings swaying gently in the breeze, their chains creaking a mournful melody. 10-year-old Emily sat alone on a bench, her head buried in her hands. But they were late, again. As darkness began to envelop the park, Emily's anxiety grew. Suddenly she heard a noise. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and it was accompanied by a low, guttural chuckle. Emily's blood ran cold. She knew that laugh. It was the same laugh she had heard earlier that day, coming from a clown at the park's entrance. Emily scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to get out of there. As she reached the gate, she felt a cold hand clamp down on her shoulder. Emily screamed, a primal sound of terror that ripped through the night. Slowly, Emily turned to face her tormentor. Her blood ran cold. It was the clown, and then he began to laugh. Hospitals, places of healing, of hope, of second chances. But beneath the sterile surfaces and the hum of medical equipment lies a palpable sense of unease. Perhaps it's the constant presence of death, the knowledge that countless souls have taken their last breath within those walls. Or maybe it's something more, something that lingers. Whatever the reason, hospitals have long been a breeding ground for ghost stories. Tales of spectral patients roaming the halls at night, their moans echoing through empty corridors. Stories of nurses who swear they've seen shadows moving in the peripheries of their vision, felt unseen hands brush against their skin. These stories, whispered among staff and patients alike, paint a chilling picture of hospitals as places where the veil between the living and the dead is thin, where restless spirits walk among us, seeking solace or perhaps revenge. Ward 3, the oncology ward. A place where hope battled against despair, where life and death walked hand in hand. It was also a place where the nurses dreaded working the night shift, their unease stemming from the strange occurrences that plagued the ward after hours. It began subtly, objects moving on their own, whispers heard in the dead of night, too faint to decipher. But as the weeks turned into months, the activity intensified. Doors slammed shut without explanation. Lights flickered erratically, and the nurses swore they could feel a cold spot near room 312, the former room of Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a kind elderly woman who had succumbed to cancer after a long and arduous battle. One particularly chilling night, a young nurse named Sarah was making her rounds, her heart pounding in her chest. As she passed by room 312, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She paused outside the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could have sworn she heard a faint humming coming from inside. Taking a deep breath, Sarah slowly opened the door. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. And then she saw her. Standing by the window, bathed in moonlight, was the unmistakable figure of Mrs. Vance. Her frail hand rested on the windowsill, her head tilted as if she were listening to something beyond the realm of human hearing. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. "Mrs. Vance?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing, meeting Sarah's. "It's all right, dear," Mrs. Vance's voice, soft as a summer breeze, seemed to echo around Sarah, even though her lips hadn't moved. "I'm not here to harm you. I just want to go home." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, Mrs. Vance vanished, leaving Sarah standing alone in the darkened room, the scent of lavender, Mrs. Vance's favourite scent, lingering in the air. From that night forward, the strange occurrences on Ward 3 ceased. But the legend of Mrs. Vance, the patient who never left, lived on, a chilling reminder that some souls never find peace, even in death. As we emerge from the depths of these terrifying tales, we are left with a lingering sense of unease. The shadows seem darker, the silence more profound. The line between reality and nightmare blurs, leaving us questioning the very nature of fear itself. Are these stories merely figments of our imagination, cautionary tales spun to keep us from venturing too far into the darkness? Or do they hold a grain of truth, a glimpse into a world beyond our comprehension where ancient evils and modern horrors collide? The answer, my friends, lies within you. Look into your heart, confront your deepest fears and decide for yourself. But be warned, once you acknowledge the darkness, it never truly goes away. It lingers at the edges of your vision, waiting for the moment to claim you. Sleep tight, and don't forget to check under the bed.